Well, good morning. My name is Emma, and I have the great privilege of reading the Bible with you this morning. We're reading Luke chapter 23, verses 1 to 25. Luke 23, verses 1 to 25. It will come up on the screen, and if you'd like a physical Bible, there's some on the back table near the door. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payments of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and to the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted. "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come across all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he'd been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He piled him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends before they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he spoke to them. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him punished and then release him." But the shouts they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will.
Thanks, Emma. Well, good morning. Welcome to church. My name is Jade. It's so good to be with you this morning. I'm one of the pastors here. Before we jump into that passage that was just read out for us, I want us to think about something. I want you to think about your daily lives. I want you to think about how Jesus is perceived here in Sydney. So think about maybe around the dinner table, or whether it's at work, or whether it's in a group chat. My hunch is that almost never will anyone say that Jesus was evil. My hunch is that almost never will anyone say, "Oh, Jesus is a bad person. He deserves what he got." Check it out this week. Try to ask someone. Don't ask someone at church today. They'll probably say something nice to you. Go ask someone out there who has told you they don't believe in Jesus. I think they'll say, "Oh, he's a good guy. Seems like a really good guy, nice teachings." You know, what would Australians say? They would say, "Oh, he's a good bloke. Yeah, mate." That was my best Australian. Nobody seems to actually be angry at Jesus. The worst you'd get is probably like, I don't care. Like, whatever, sure, he was nice. He just might be the most approved of man in history. And the strange thing is that with all of this approval from the general public, it doesn't seem to change much about how this general public lives. Sure, they approve of him, but they're not really wanting to follow his teachings. They don't want to give him any of their time. And so somehow this massive amount of respect and approval, but there's also a lot of ignoring. He gets admiration, but he doesn't get approached. And so today, as we jump into our passage, what I want us to realize is that things aren't that different from the time when Jesus went on trial. You see, what's happening in our passage is that what we're actually walking into today in this passage is a courtroom where a very similar dynamic is at play, because this is the strange thing. The strange thing is that verdict after verdict, they keep coming in as Jesus' trial, and they all come in Jesus' favor. Pilate says he's innocent. Herod says he's innocent. Pilate again says he's innocent a few more times. But somehow, even with all of this approval, all of these verdicts in Jesus' favor, it still doesn't save Jesus from the cross. Now, one thing worth knowing about the Bible and how the Bible works, every passage in the Bible is in the Bible because God is after something in us. And when I say us, I don't mean just people in general. I don't mean people long time ago or people in the ancient world or that person over there, but not me. When I say us, I mean us in this room today here at Grace City. And so the scriptures don't just tell us what happened, although they do tell us what happened. The scriptures don't only change people across history, although they have. But the scriptures, God's inspired word, they hold a mirror up to our lives today, you and me. And I want us to be mindful of that as we enter this courtroom, because in this courtroom today, we're going to see a lot of different types of people. We're going to meet a governor. We're going to meet a king. We're going to meet a religious leader. We're going to meet a crowd, a prisoner, many different people responding and reacting to Jesus in different ways. And so whether you've been following Jesus for 30 years or this is your first time at church, I believe this passage has something significant to say to every single one of us today. And one of the strange things about this passage is actually that the question isn't, was Jesus guilty? That's not what the question of this passage is. Because as we've seen, when Emma read it out for us, no one really seems to be debating that. Herod finds him guilty. Pilate finds him guilty. The people in power, they find him innocent. And so the question actually is, how does a man that everyone in power finds innocent end up on a cross? That's the question that we're trying to figure out today together. And so we're going to work through this passage in 3 movements, what the courts actually find. And then after that, we're going to look at why everyone still wants to get rid of him, even after the verdicts. And then finally, we're going to look at who actually walks free. And of course, all along the way, we'll be reflecting on how that lands on us today. So let's jump in, what the courts actually find. And so where are we now? Leading up to this, Jesus was in the garden. He was praying. He got betrayed by Judas. He was arrested. He was taken to the elders and Jewish leaders, and they kind of had their own trial. And during their own trial, they decided this guy is guilty. But what's the problem with them? They can't execute him. They can't kill him. And so they need to bring him before the Roman authorities so that he can be executed. And that's where our passage starts. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. Now that whole assembly phrase, it just means, and we'll see it in different ways across the passage. We'll see it maybe as the chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law, the people, the crowd. These are the whole assembly that were making these charges against Jesus. So these are the whole group condemning Jesus, and they take him before Pilate. And what I want you to notice in the section that we're going to see is the difference between what they accuse him of in chapter 22, so the chapter just before this, what we heard last week preached on, preached on last week, and then what they accuse him of today in chapter 23. And the difference between those two things help us understand who these people are and what their intentions are with Jesus. And so think with me back to chapter 22. They bring him before these elders, these chief priests, and they ask him, "Are you the Son of God?" And then Jesus says, "You say that I am." And their response, "Why do we even need more testimony?" That's it. He said it. He's proved that he is guilty. We have heard it from his own lips. That's it. We need to get him before Pilate so we can kill this guy. So that's the accusation. What's the charge? The charge is heresy, blasphemy. He's claiming to be the Son of God. It's a religious charge. So this man deserves execution, but of course they don't have the authority. They bring him before Pilate. And now look at what they say when they bring him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation," so insurrection. "He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar." So he doesn't want to pay taxes, and he gets other people to not pay taxes. That's a problem with the ATO. And then he claims to be Messiah, a king. Isn't that interesting? Notice what they're doing. This whole assembly, when they were accusing him last night, they accused him of heresy. Very clearly. They didn't talk about taxes. No one cared. All they brought was the charge against him, and it was about heresy. But suddenly, they're before Pilate, they're before a political figure, and they know their audience. They're very smart. And so what do? They know that the charge of heresy won't move the Roman governor. He doesn't care about their theology. And so what they do is they translate the charges. They translate the charges, so blasphemy becomes treason, and a religious problem is turned into a political threat. He subverts the nation, he opposes payment of taxes, and he claims to be king. This is not just some random angry mob coming at Jesus. This is a calculated, strategic move that has been planned to a T. They know what they're doing. They know their audience. And Luke, just a few chapters earlier, he told us what Jesus thought about the taxes. A group of them come up to Jesus and they say, "Should we pay taxes to Caesar?" Thinking that they can trap Jesus. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's." That's just 3 chapters ago. Luke wants to make sure that we remember Jesus' position on taxes. Jesus is pro-ATO. So those are the charges that we see. The subverting the nation, taxes, and claims to be king. And what's interesting about Pilate is a smart man. Pilate knows his area. Pilate doesn't accidentally become a governor in a Roman province. And so he ignores the first 2 and he jumps straight at the biggest charge, which is, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He asks them. "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "You have said so." You have said so. What an interesting response by Jesus. And an interesting thing to notice is that at this point, this is the total sum of what Jesus says throughout this whole chapter or this whole section. Everyone else is shouting, accusing, questioning, demanding. It's Jesus is at the center. It's all targeted at him. And this whole time, all he says is, "You have said so," that one time. It's kind of like not a no, but not fully a yes. My hunch is at least part of what Jesus is saying is, yes, I'm actually the king, but not in the way that you're thinking. Or yes, I'm actually the king, but not in the way that you understand things. And this whole conversation is kind of useless because me and the Father have planned all this. And the ultimate irony in all of this is that Jesus is actually the king in that room. And he's not just the king of the Jews. And he's the king of everyone. He's the king of everything. He's the king of life, and the king of life is standing there, and they think that they hold his life in their hands. And they're questioning him. Luke has been telling us this since chapter 1. An angel appears to Mary and says that your baby boy will sit on David's throne and his kingdom will be eternal. And even just a few days earlier, the crowds sang it on the way to Jerusalem as Jesus came in on the donkey. Part of the crowds that were now singing a different song, just a few days earlier, were calling this man king. We'll get to that later. So that's what they brought against Jesus. That's the charge they brought against him to Pilate. And now Pilate, being the Roman official he is and being intelligent and can see what's going on in the room, he examines Jesus, he hears Jesus' answer, and he's able to read the person that is in front of him enough to say this. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for the charge against this man. That's the first time we hear it from Pilate, innocent. Jesus is innocent, but then the crowds shout louder. They insist. He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and he's come all the way here. He's been doing this for so long. This guy's so bad. So they're trying to push this idea that Jesus is this wild rebel who's stirring up and rising up people against Caesar. And Pilate can just see the riot coming his way. Pilate's trying to find a way out. He's like, how am I going to deal with this? This guy's clearly innocent. I don't want to be in the middle of all this mess. And then suddenly he hears a word and he grabs onto that word. And the word is Galilee. He started in Galilee. Look what Pilate says. On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Pilate is so relieved. He's like, thankfully, I can just get this guy out of here, send him to Herod. He's Herod's problem. I don't need to deal with him. And so Pilate's quite happy that he can do that. We'll jump to Herod in just a little bit in our second movement. But for now, what we see is that Jesus is sent to Herod. Herod has a conversation. We'll talk about that later. And then Herod actually sends Jesus back to Pilate. And then Pilate says this when Jesus comes back. He says, you brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Me as a Roman official, I have examined him and there's no basis to the charges. My call, my verdict is that Jesus is innocent. But he doesn't stop there. He then says, neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. So Herod also hasn't found any charges against Jesus to be true. And remember who Herod is. Herod isn't just another Roman official, although he is under the Roman government and he works for them. But Herod, in some ways, was considered at least partly Jewish or within the Jewish kind of space. And so what Pilate is saying, he's saying, I've looked at him and I think he's innocent. Herod, kind of one of you guys, he's looked at him. He said he's innocent too. And so what are we talking about here? Why are you guys still here? And so by this point, and this is really important because Luke does something awesome here, he shows us that Jesus has been examined by two judges. And that's really important, especially to the Jewish leaders and elders there, because in God's law, back in Deuteronomy, a matter had to be established by the testimony of two witnesses. And I think Luke here is showing us that even by the standards of our scriptures, the innocence of Jesus has been legally established. Two rulers have examined him, and they both have found Jesus innocent. And then we see Pilate coming out in verse 22. He says, for the third time he spoke to them, why? Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. I don't get it. Why are you guys so against this guy? That's the third time we hear from Pilate. And I want you to notice something. That Pilate's question never gets answered. There's no evidence that is ever produced. There are no witnesses that are called forth to speak against Jesus. Pilate asks why, and no one answers. So no honest examination of Jesus ever actually finds him at fault. The courts find that Jesus is innocent, and 2,000 years on, we're still in the same place. Jesus still has the same verdict. The most examined life in human history, and the world's verdict has always landed pretty much where Pilate landed. He was innocent. Really not a bad guy. Which brings us back to the strange thing from where we started, because in this chapter, the multiple innocent verdicts against Jesus, or with Jesus, across the different power levels even, somehow still don't set Jesus free. And if the courts keep finding him innocent, why does everyone still want to get rid of Jesus? So let's jump into that thought in our second movement. So why does everyone still want to get rid of Jesus? Well, Pilate's answer, or at least his first answer, was to send the problem to Herod. So Pilate wanted to get rid of him because Jesus was honestly just giving him a headache. It was a problem. The people were on the brink of rioting. That's Pilate. Pilate sends him to Herod. Let's think about Herod for a moment, as I said we would. And so here's verses 8 and 9. When Herod saw Jesus, here's a surprising thing, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. So Herod is greatly pleased to see Jesus today. He's been wanting to meet Jesus for years. Back in chapter 9, Luke tells us that Herod was hearing about all these signs and he wanted to meet Jesus. And finally, the day when Jesus of Nazareth himself, it's like a superstar. I have a celebrity here. Jesus of Nazareth is in my court today. Not only that, he's in chains. I can do whatever I want. I can ask him questions. Herod is in control. This is the dream for a narcissistic psychopath like Herod. Whoops. But question after question, and Jesus says nothing. He doesn't say a word. And going through the entire Gospel of Luke, it feels like Herod is actually the only person that Jesus doesn't say a word to. And so the question, at least the question that came to my mind, is why isn't Jesus speaking? Why does he say not one word to Herod? He's at Herod's mercy right now. Pilate has found Jesus innocent. And if Pilate's found Jesus innocent, he sent him to Herod. So really, if Herod is happy and Herod sends him out, Jesus is free. But Jesus doesn't say a word. And so my hunch is that it's because of what Herod wanted. Herod wanted a performance. Herod wanted a magic trick. He wanted to be entertained. He wanted to be amused and impressed. But Jesus is not a performer. He does not dance when you say dance. Jesus does not perform on demand. And actually, back in chapter 11, there were crowds that were demanding a sign from Jesus, and he called it the posture of a wicked generation. And he told them that no sign would be given to them. And now Jesus stands before Herod, a man who wants exactly that, a sign, a show. And Jesus does not perform. He does not say a word. Jesus always had a word for the seeker. Jesus always had a word for the broken. Jesus always had a word for the doubters. But Jesus doesn't answer this spectator. And to prove that Herod didn't actually care about knowing more about Jesus, he wasn't actually a seeker, Luke tells us this. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. Within moments, the guy who was greatly pleased to see Jesus, when he doesn't get what he wants, what does he do? He just turns to ridicule, to mockery. When Jesus doesn't perform, when Jesus doesn't please him, he dresses him up as a jerk king. He laughs at him with his soldiers. I'm sure some of you have experienced it as well, but there have been a few times in my walk with Christ when I've been in a conversation. Someone may be asking me question after question about Jesus. And at some point, I realize that there's something off with this conversation. And at some point, I remember trying to figure it out, like, why do I feel so uncomfortable? Because it can't be because questions are hard, or I'm definitely in the wrong vocation. It can't be that I'm worried that I can't answer them, because if I can't answer them, that's okay. I can just go ask someone who's much smarter than me, and the room's full. And so what was it about these very particular rare conversations that bothered me so much? It wasn't when people were doubting. It wasn't when people didn't even believe. It was actually these conversations when I slowly realized that questions weren't really questions. The people that were asking them didn't want an answer. They wanted a show. Jesus was more like a curiosity that they kind of just wanted to poke at. They weren't seeking, they were spectating. It was a sport to them. They were trying to make me squirm in my answers. They're trying to reduce Jesus to pithy one-liners. It's mockery. And it's those conversations that are the only ones that I leave with a bitter taste in my mouth. That's the Herod posture. And I want you to see how thin this posture is, this pretending to be pleased with Jesus. We can see it in the passage, this curiosity that Herod supposedly had. It's so thin because within moments when Herod doesn't get what he wants, what happens? It turns into mockery. So this Herod posture, this curiosity that turns into mockery within a moment, is something that I want us to be aware of, not just in the other person, but in our own hearts. And then right after this, we have this very, very strange verse. I wonder if you picked up on it when Emma was reading. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Just an update on the relationship in case you guys cared. I was going to make a Facebook reference, but I feel like that makes me old. Do people use Facebook? I love Facebook. Anyway. So these two men couldn't stand each other. And the day that they both get rid of Jesus together is the day they become friends. What a weird truth to include here. Now, what's interesting is that the first Christians, and we read this in Acts, which is kind of Luke's sequel, part 2, they actually noticed this truth. And when the church were praying about what happened to Jesus, they said that this moment fulfilled Psalm 2. You see, in Psalm 2, it says that the kings of the earth take their stand together against the Lord and against his anointed one. And so Herod and Pilate, enemies, kings, stand together against the one true king. So that's Herod. You have this shallowly curious person who just wants Jesus to perform a show for him, and Jesus doesn't say a word. And then we have Pilate. We've seen Pilate's problem. It's not that he doesn't know the verdict. It's not that he doesn't know whether Jesus is innocent or guilty. It's that the verdict will cost him something. He will either lose his power, the Roman Empire will take it away from him, or even possibly, depending on if things went out of hand with the riots and stuff, he could even lose his life. He's got a crowd on the edge of a riot, and his job is to keep people calm enough. Why? So that they can pay taxes. That's what the people were to the Roman Empire. And so while he seems to be completely convinced that Jesus is innocent, he's also unwilling to pay for this conviction that he has. So that's Herod and Pilate. And then the third group we see is this crowd. Look at this crowd with me. But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man, release Barabbas to us." And then in verse 21, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And then verse 23, and I think this verse includes 4 of what should be the eeriest words in the whole Bible. Look at this. But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified. And here are the 4 words. And their shouts prevailed. and their shouts prevailed. Not the evidence. There was no evidence. Not the testimony of witnesses. There were no witnesses. Not the verdict, because the verdict, if it prevailed, that was innocence. Their shouts prevailed. The loudest voices in the room drowned out the true voice. And this is where I want us to remember who is shouting. Remember that all through this gospel of Luke, the leaders couldn't lay a hand on Jesus because they were afraid of the people. The people hung on Jesus' words. The people were like his shield. Some of these same people were on the road just a few days ago with palm branches singing, "Blessed be the King." And now they're in a crowd, and the crowd's new chant is "Crucify him, crucify him." Because it's easier to chant whatever everyone else is saying than to chant the opposite. And suddenly the shield becomes a mob, and "Blessed is the King" becomes "Crucify him." And so we see Herod trading Jesus for an afternoon of entertainment. We see Pilate trading him for a quiet province, for a safe career. We see the whole assembly. We see the leaders, they trade him for their position and their power. And then finally we see the crowds trade him for another person that they ask for. Now what's interesting is that it's not necessarily that any of these people really hated Jesus specifically. They just loved something else much, much more. And this is where we need to remember that this passage isn't just about people a long time ago. Some of us today in this room, we sit where Pilate sits, genuinely convinced about Jesus, but unwilling to pay for what that means in our life. Maybe it's because of work or home or whatever it is, but the crowd is really loud. The riots seem to be getting louder. And so that verdict that we know we've made in our hearts is just too costly to actually live in our lives. Maybe some of us sit in Herod's seat, interested in Jesus, happy to ask questions, as long as he keeps entertaining us. As long as we can stay at least middle class. As long as we can have at least this much money. I don't want to be a billionaire. I just want a few million. I want to have this kind of house. I want to have this kind of relationship. Or as long as he stays useful to me. Maybe I can use him as my mascot for my politics, for my team, my side of the culture war. It's funny how both the left and the right try to claim Jesus in different ways. The left want to claim him as the refugee, the ally. The right want to claim him as the conquering king who fights and chops everyone's heads off. Both want a Jesus who performs for them. And that's the Jesus that we want sometimes, isn't it? Now, I need to be careful here because the point of this passage is not be braver than Pilate. It's not don't get swept along with the crowd. Those are true things. Be braver than Pilate. Don't get swept along with the crowd. But nobody in this courtroom needed more willpower so that what happened wouldn't have happened. Jesus wouldn't have avoided crucifixion if someone had been a bit braver. The people in this courtroom didn't need a better performance. They needed something to be done for them. Something they could not do for themselves. And that is exactly what God was doing in this courtroom at that very moment without them even knowing. And we can see that especially in the one person that we haven't spoken about yet. And this is our final movement. Who actually ends up walking free from this courtroom? And it's the one that the crowds end up asking for. And what happens to this guy is kind of like the whole gospel summarized in just a few verses. Look at this. Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Sorry, remind me again what Jesus' charges were? Insurrection and murder. So he was accused of insurrection, inciting the people to rebellion, stirring up the people, and they found him innocent every single time. And the irony we see here is that the difference between these two men is that Barabbas wasn't just accused. He was accused, he was charged, he was convicted, he was sitting in a prison cell waiting for a cross. Maybe he could hear them making the cross for him. Quite possibly the very cross that Jesus ends up taking on his behalf. And so what we have here is we have two men before a crowd, both charged with insurrection, one actually innocent, the other charged and convicted and waiting for his crucifixion. And the crowds come out, and what do they say? Free the guilty and kill the innocent. Free the guilty and kill the innocent. That's actually what they said. This isn't a make-believe story. This is real. This is what actually happened that day. I want us to feel the weight of this because I'm sure that most of us have read this many, many times. I'm sure that you've heard many sermons on this topic. But we need to stop and realize what we've just read. Because across all of human history, there has never been anyone more innocent and yet condemned for something he did not do than Jesus Christ. This is the injustice that sets the bar for all injustice. The only truly innocent man who ever lived traded in for a murderer. Now, these next verses, I'm sure we've read them before, but I want us to take them slowly as we break them apart. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. So Luke could have just said, he released Barabbas. We already know what his charges were. But Luke wants us to read that charge sheet just one more time. And then, the one they asked for. Do you have to sit, like we know they asked for him. Why are you saying it again, Luke? He wants us to slow down and recognize what is happening right now. The one the crowds asked for. Barabbas didn't ask for this. Barabbas has no idea what's even going on. Barabbas is asked for, and the door opens and he comes out. And then that final piece, and surrendered Jesus to their will. To their will. Remember with me, the night before in the garden, Jesus is on his knees, sweating, praying about the horror that was coming. Father, if it is your will, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but your will be done. Not my will, but the Father's will. And yet Luke ends Jesus' trial by saying that Pilate surrendered Jesus to their will. So whose will is it? Is it the Father's will, or is it the crowd's will? I think it's worth taking a second here and looking at Acts 23. And this is as it's being preached, Peter says, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. So yes, their shouts prevailed. He surrendered Jesus to their will, but only because the Father, for the sake of the world, for your sake and my sake, let them. Jesus knew the night before on his way to the garden, he quoted Isaiah. He said, it is written, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Jesus is saying, I must be numbered with the transgressors. I must be counted as a criminal. And suddenly, here he is being traded for a murderer. He's about to walk up a hill and be on a cross between two other criminals. And so who actually walks free? The guilty man walks free because the innocent man takes his place. And this isn't a miscarriage of justice that God needs to somehow manage to salvage. This is actually the plan. This is the gospel in a single verse. Barabbas contributed nothing to being freed from prison. He was guilty, but he was asked for. And so he walked out into the sunlight while Jesus was walking to the cross. Because the innocent one is condemned, the guilty one gets set free. That's the Christian story today. That's the Christian story. Jesus gets our cross while we get his freedom. This is big enough for us to take a moment. There's a phrase that the church has used for centuries for what we just saw. And I want us to look at it for a moment because I think it's helpful for us to understand this concept and to know this language. And the language is very simple: substitutionary atonement. Yes, substitutionary atonement. It sounds very big. It's actually quite simple. Substitution: someone takes your place. Barabbas walks free. One life traded for another. Jesus steps into his place. And then atonement, which is actually an Old English word, which is at one meant, being made one again. It means being made right again, in right relationship. The debt was dealt with. The separation between us and God is closed so that God and the guilty can be one again. And then there's one more word that the church sometimes puts in front of these two words, and so it's penal substitutionary atonement. And penal just means to do with punishment. And here's why it matters. Remember what we said. This is the injustice that sets the bar over every other injustice. But watch what God is doing inside of it. Because God is holy, sin can't just be waved away. If God simply said, forget it, don't worry about it, then he is an unjust God. He would stop being just. Every sin has to be answered for, either in the sinner or in the perfect substitute. And on that Friday, at the very moment the world was committing its greatest injustice, God was carrying out perfect justice. Sin was being punished in the perfect substitute. Not an unwilling substitute. Remember what Jesus said. He said, Father, but not my will, but your will be done. He was a willing substitute. The Son chose the cross that was built for Barabbas, that was built for you and for me. And so putting them all together, and you're holding the core of the Christian faith, Jesus takes the place of the guilty. Our sentence lands on him while his freedom lands on us so that we can be brought back to God. Peter later says, he says, Christ died for sins once and for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. And so the next time someone asks you what Christians actually believe happened on the cross, you say, penal substitutionary atonement. Please don't say that. Explain it. Let's close our time together. Jesus, the most approved of man in history, respected but ignored, admired but not approached, innocent but still traded away. Approval didn't save Jesus in this courtroom, and our simple approving of Jesus doesn't save us today. And so if you're here today and you're new to hearing about the Christian faith, I want you to hear something from what Peter preaches just a little later in Acts, in Luke's second book. And what he says to the crowd, remember, this crowd is the very people that shouted, crucify him. They were the reason why Jesus went to the cross. And so Peter is standing in front of them as he preaches, and this is what he says. He says, you disowned the holy and righteous one and asked that a murderer be released to you. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. And then he says, repent. Repent then and turn to God so that your sins may be wiped out. Instead of just condemning them, instead of just heaping more coals on their head that they probably deserved, look at how gracious and merciful and loving our God is. He's offering them salvation and forgiveness. The one that they traded away is still the one holding the door open. And so for all of us today, whether we've been following Jesus for 30 years or this is your first Sunday, don't just admire Jesus. Don't get used to penal substitutionary atonement. Don't be desensitized to what Jesus has done. Don't just think that Jesus is a great guy. The innocent king took the place of the guilty. He took my place. He took your place. And the way back is already paved by him. Even after everything we've done, even after screaming, crucify him in 100 different ways in our lives today, he says, come to me. Why don't you join me as we pray to this wonderful King? Father, thank you that Jesus was truly innocent and yet was traded away for the guilty. Thank you that on that Friday, your perfect justice and your deep mercy met at that same cross. Thank you that Jesus chose the cross that was built for us, and that our sentence landed on him and his freedom landed on us. Forgive us for the times where we have shouted in our own ways, crucify him. Help us, Father, to trust him. Make us a people who never get used to what he has done on the cross for us. And we pray this in the name of our kind and wonderful and merciful and powerful King Jesus. Amen.